So Mary Beth and I are both, we are splitting the message today. So she nominated me to speak first. So I am going to speak, and then Mary Beth will speak. So when Mary Beth asked me to join her in this service, I eagerly agreed, excited about the chance to work with her to talk about resilient women, and also about the fact that studying history gives me hope in the face of despair. I will admit, however, that I am more used to giving history lectures than sermons, so you may have to bear with me through a little bit more history than you're necessarily used to. So forgive me. So I am mostly, sometimes, able to maintain my hope at times like this, because studying the past reminds me that throughout times of great despair and injustice, there are always everyday people who have the resilience, the grit, we might say, to persist and to slog toward a better version of our nation and our communities. Their visions may have been hampered by the context of their times, and they were not perfect. No one is. But nonetheless, their courage and persistence in calling out injustice can remind us to do the same. So today, I'm going to introduce you to one of those people, Matilda Joslyn Gage, here on the left. A founding mother of the women's suffrage movement, but one whose name is rarely remembered, although she founded the National Women's Suffrage Association alongside Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, whose names are much more familiar. She edited a suffrage newspaper with the two of them from 1878 to 1881, and she worked for women's suffrage until her death in 1898. But by the last decade of her life, her goals had become too radical, her vision too critical for the majority of suffragists, much less everyday Americans, and she was written out of the popular history of the suffrage movement. So Matilda Joslyn was born almost 200 years ago in March of 1826 in Cicero, New York, to parents who were fervent abolitionists. As a young child, she handed out abolitionist pamphlets alongside her parents, and her family's home was a stop on the Underground Railroad. Her father was a physician who believed in educating daughters, so he gave her anatomy and physiology lessons alongside the basic reading and writing. Her parents were religious freethinkers who urged their children to question religious doctrines and to come to their own understanding of the truth. To further her education, her parents enrolled her in the Clinton Liberal Institute. This was the first educational institution created by American Universalists. And I picked her to talk about before I knew this fact. So this is the first connection between Matilda and our own UU history. Oddly enough, it's also a connection to my own history. The Clinton Liberal Institute is in Clinton, New York, which is the town my grandmother lived in when I was a child. As a Universalist school, there were no religious services held at the school, and it was coeducational, although boys and girls learned from different teachers in different buildings. This was, however, very progressive for the 1830s and 1840s. After her graduation, Matilda, there's too many M's today. Matilda wanted to become a doctor, just like Maria Montessori, but it was a few decades earlier, and women were not allowed to enroll in medical school anywhere in the United States at that time. So at age 18, she instead married Henry Gage, a dry goods merchant, and they settled down in Fayetteville, New York, and raised their eventual brood of 5 children, while also continuing to fight together for the abolition of slavery. Matilda began to write for newspapers in the 1850s, and she gave her first public speech in favor of suffrage at the Third National Women's Rights Convention in Syracuse in 1852. Just for context, the first women's suffrage convention was in 1848 in Seneca Falls. She wasn't at that one, but she was there 4 years later. Like many of her compatriots in the cause, she offered pointed critiques of women's limited options in American society at the time, arguing, this is a quote, "Self-reliance is one of the first lessons to be taught our daughters. They should be educated with our sons, and equally with them, taught to look forward to some independent means of support. Marriage has been looked to as the acme of hope by women. And why? Because all lucrative and honorable means of support have been seized by men, and women have been driven to marriage as a necessity." To drive home her points, she offered proof of women's achievements, reminding her listeners of the many women who, although, quote, "trammeled by might and custom, were shining examples who serve as beacon lights of what may be attained by genius, labor, energy, and perseverance combined. I suspect that her denial to medical school may have still stung, and no matter the quality of her family life, she felt the limits of 19th century womanhood acutely. To prove just how wrong were the men who argued women were ill-suited and incapable of scientific work, Gage went to work unearthing more examples of women's achievements. In 1870, she published a pamphlet, which later became an 1883 article in the widely circulated North American Review titled, quote, "The Woman as Inventor." She named women ranging from Sappho to astronomer Caroline Herschel to none other than Margaret Fuller, who Mary Beth will be telling us about in a few minutes. Within both of these publications, she systematically debunked claims that women were unfit to be either scientists or inventors, offering examples from across the centuries of women's intellectual, scientific, and technological innovation. But Gage did not just write. She also led and organized. Like many women of her time, she dedicated more time to politics after her children were grown. Many women today as well. She helped found the National Women's Suffrage Association in 1869 and served as its president from 1875 to 1876. And she served as either vice president or as a member of the Executive Council for more than 20 years. She served as president of the New York Suffrage Association for 5 years, and under her leadership, women successfully gained the right to vote in school board elections in New York. Reportedly, she sat outside her local polls to ensure that every woman who wanted to vote could. But it would be Gage's writing about religion and about the role of the church in women's oppression that proved too much for many of her fellow suffragists. In 1890, she published a call for a, quote, liberal women's convention, in which she decried the growing influence of Christianity in the government and in public affairs. She objected to the influx of Catholics into the nation, which we might, rightfully perhaps, attribute to the prevalent anti-Catholic sentiment of her time. But she went further. Unlike many suffragists, she also called out the growing power of Protestant reformers. Inspired by the social gospel, these were men and women who were calling for temperance, Sunday rest days, and religious education in schools, among other reforms. To Gage, these efforts represented a dangerous infringement of religious liberty that threatened the very heart of the nation. So she called on women to gather to, quote, unite upon a platform of opposition to the teaching and aim of that ever most unscrupulous enemy of freedom, the church. I don't know. 2 years later, in 1892, she published Woman, Church, and State, the original expose of male collaboration against the female sex. I kid you not, that is the title. An over 200-page book dedicated to cataloging the systematic oppression of women by the Christian church. And I want to make clear here that she's talking about Christianity, not just the Catholic Church, right? Christianity in general, the systems of Christianity. Within the pages of this text, Gage laid out a history of women's dispossession of cultural and political power under Christianity, arguing that the pre-Christian world featured numerous matriarchies whose history had been deliberately forgotten by church fathers. Sentences like this, quote, the careful student of history will discover that Christianity has been of very little value in advancing civilization, but has done a great deal toward retarding it, surely did little to endear her ideas to many of her Christian readers. The church degraded women, she noted, by destroying her self-respect and teaching her to feel consciousness of guilt in the very fact of her existence. One of the church's most powerful weapons, she argued, was the charge of witchcraft, which targeted not only a woman, but her whole family, causing what Gage described as both psychological and spiritual harm. Many of Gage's conclusions echo those of late 20th century feminists, most of whom had not read any of her work, but who recognized the stifling effects of Christian patriarchy on women's rights. And just to be clear, again, it was the church as an institution that Gage opposed, not Christianity as a set of values or teachings, but the way that it had been implemented and had evolved over the years. So what can we learn from Gage's life and work? First, Her life and work remind me of why I study history. And that was not what I set out to conclude when I started figuring out what I was going to say today. And I'll explain that. So first, Gage spent years researching and writing about the very real achievements of women in history at a time when most men and women denied the existence of that history. She used historical research to combat prevalent assumptions about the appropriate and natural role of women and to demand the equality of women. Her free-thinking parents and her universalist education inspired her to challenge dominant Christian teachings that justified the subjugation of women. Second, she fought for what she thought was right, even when her allies disagreed. When more conservative suffragists triumphed in the national organization in the 1890s, she left and founded her own organization. She rejected the idea that women should only fight for suffrage, instead urging that they should take on a broader set of issues, including, and very importantly for her, the separation of church and state. Third, resilient people inspire others. Her thinking and writing left unexpected legacies. So over 100 years later, historian Margaret Rossiter in the 1980s came across Gage's pamphlet on women inventors and perhaps responding to her own professional challenges, began to research the history of women in science. Her decades-long project turned into a 3-volume history of women in science, and Rossiter's coining of the term the Matilda Effect in 1993 to label the all-too-common erasure of women's contributions to scientific progress. The term caught on, as a quick internet search will reveal. But interestingly enough, or perhaps not surprisingly, Rossiter's early career path was almost as difficult as that of the woman she wrote about. She finished her PhD in 1971, but was forced to cobble together short-term gigs teaching and researching until Cornell hired her in 1989, after she won a MacArthur Genius Grant. She built her career on doggedly following the trail of female scientists that Gage laid out, and although women still suffer from the Matilda Effect, at least we have a name for it now. Finally, one of my favorite things to do when I teach is to tell stories that connect the past and present in unexpected ways. So let me do that for you today. Matilda and her husband had 5 children, the youngest of whom was named Maud. Maud married a man named L. Frank Baum. Yes, that L. Frank Baum, who was a failed businessman until he wrote a book that featured some very prominent witches, apparently inspired by the research and writing of his mother-in-law Matilda, who he admired very much. So it is thanks to Matilda Joslyn Gage that we have not only Dorothy, Toto, and the Wizard, but also Glinda and Elphaba, themselves resilient, if fictional, women.
That was fun. Let's see if I can do this too without my papers flying. But if the papers fly, we'll just say it's the good witches. Margaret Fuller was born in 1810, and she was the first child of Timothy and Sarah Fuller. Timothy was a lawyer who would soon become a U.S. congressman from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Timothy had graduated second in his class at Harvard and never in his life veered from his opinion that being intellectual is the top quality people can have. He decided his children should be brilliant, which he would make happen by requiring of them what he called a severe though kind education. Later, many commented that he was clear on the severe, not so clear on the kind. At just 3, Margaret was learning to read and write. At 6, she was composing perfect and non-whimsical letters to her father when he was in D.C. And as a human being, what is the point of 6-year-olds besides being whimsical? At 6, she was also, per his instructions, learning Latin. When he was home, he assigned her daily lessons and then kept her up at night until it was convenient for him to hear what she had learned that day. Have you ever made a first grader stay up until the evening news so you could correct their Latin? By 9, Margaret was translating between Latin and English, plus reading Roman and Greek texts. She also took music lessons, although her dad criticized her because she was not perfectly musical. He chastised her. To excel in all things should be your constant aim. Mediocrity is obscurity. Aren't we glad Alex doesn't have this opinion of us? At 10, she was allowed to go to the new school near her home, where among her classmates was young Oliver Wendell Holmes, who thought she was weird and smart. So we need to talk about transcendentalism, which was the philosophical, spiritual, and literary movement that developed to a great degree out of the older, stricter Unitarianism, which had evolved out of even stricter obedience-based Christianity. I overgeneralize, you know. Transcendentalism, though, evolved from the radical belief that people in nature are inherently good. Transcendentalists believe that the experience of what we call the holy and the divine is open to people who seek it. Who knew? This was the world Margaret grew into as a teenager and young adult. She was surrounded by intellectuals who were reading, discussing, and writing their thoughts and observations. It was heady stuff, though mostly open to men. Unitarians, the liberals that they were, understood some women were brilliant, but it was not common, and thus never smooth sailing for Margaret to become herself. There are many, many parts to her story, but many of us who are women can relate to this. As a child, she was expected to study hard, learn everything, get the best grades, and to only read or do things that improved her mind. By herself, she would eventually learn Greek, Latin, French, Italian, and German. But all those accomplishments, and then she was judged as a young person for not being ladylike. She was not slender. Her spine was not straight. Some think she may have had scoliosis. She had auburn hair when red hair was considered low class, and her complexion was not porcelain fine. Men liked to talk with her, but then they went home to their pretty wives who didn't know how to translate from Greek to Latin. Many people, including her father, complained that she talked too much. Do we know this? Thankfully, Margaret Fuller was also determined. By the time she was 23 and still living at home, she was responsible for the education of all of her younger siblings. I think by then she had 5. That year, she was also invited to produce some articles for fellow transcendentalists who edited periodicals. Her father quit public office and his law firm failed, and so he has sold their comfortable home to buy a weary farm that would never succeed. And then, 2 years later, he died of cholera. Margaret was just 25 when she took on the responsibility for the support of her family. They had relatives who could have helped, but those relationships had soured over the years from the elitist attitude of her father. Their help was neither gracious nor enough. Margaret set herself to finding ways to earn an income. She taught school off and on, including Louisa May Alcott's parents' farm. She authored articles for magazines. She almost single-handedly edited The Dial, which was a magazine of transcendental thought, usually completely credited to Ralph Waldo Emerson. And then she invented subscription discussions. Wealthy women paid money to attend her lectures and guided conversations. She was successful at this. Women liked to go to her classes that truly were college-level courses for women not allowed by convention to go to college. At the same time, she was meeting these women and these daughters of many of the most well-connected thinkers and leaders of the day. And this networking launched her circle of influence. One of her students was, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who would go on to be, as we know, one of the stalwarts of the suffragette movement. By her early 30s, she was writing for Horace Greeley's New York Tribune and soon became the newspaper's first female editor. She parlayed her position into investigating and then authoring articles and columns about women's prisons and mental institutions into which no one had gone before except people who were put there. Her writing began to spark reform. When she was 34, friends invited her, you're going to like this part, to travel with them to the wild and woolly American West of Chicago, Milwaukee, and Native communities in Wisconsin. She wrote about it, and it was called Summer on the Lakes, and that book started to make a steady income for her family. That's when it started to turn around. But you might enjoy this one observation. Charming was the place where we stopped by the vicinity of the lakes along the banks of the loveliest little Bark River, which flowed in rapid amber brightness through fields and dells. I think some of you live close to the rapid amber brightness of the Bark River, right? In 1846, the New York Tribune sent her to Europe as the first female foreign correspondent. She would be in Europe for 4 years, her last 2 years in Italy. She was in Europe in 1848 when the continent was on fire as brave and brilliant thinking people were pushing for reform in their various governments. Most failed in the short term and yet changed the way people thought about how and for whom governments ought to work. It started then. Margaret reported what was happening as well as she was preparing her notes for a longer book. And then she met a man. Giovanni Angelo Osoli was a nobleman of modest means who was volunteering in the Civic Guard. Margaret and Giovanni moved in together in Florence. Can you imagine? And they eventually probably married. No one is 100% sure. But in order to protect the baby son, Angelino. But by then, Italy had become too dangerous for them. Margaret had her book to write, so they set sail to come back to the U.S. Their ship encountered a hurricane off Long Island, slammed into a sandbar, and 100 yards from shore, all 3 members of their family perished, and Margaret's trunk of writing was lost. It is depressing and heartbreaking. It's tragic when someone with so much to do and give is cut short. She was only 40. And yet, her body of work remains. In 1845, she had published Women in the 19th Century, which discussed the role women played in American democracy. And it became one of the major documents of American feminism and was read by every thinker of the 19th century. So what can we learn about embodying resilience from Margaret Fuller? There are 3 things that caught my imagination and my attention. 1, she persisted. After her father died, Margaret understood she would need to find a way to earn income, even though there was no path ahead to do that. She didn't waste her energy railing against the impossibility of it. She lurched awkwardly into trying different ways of doing this through teaching and writing. She did what she could imagine to do, and along the way became friends with people who introduced her to more friends, and her path emerged because she kept trying. She used her community as a resource. She was born into a rarefied collection of people, much like us. Most appreciated her, but did not become her close friend because they thought to varying degrees that she was weird, homely, and awkward. She had every right to turn her back on their disdain, but she didn't. She truly became friends with a few, but mostly she utilized her community as a resource. She belonged to them. They belonged to her. She didn't waste her time or energy having opinions about their personalities. And this is a rare and interesting quality. We do not exploit each other, but we do not totally have to find each other groovy. You know, we can belong to each other for the ways in which we support each other as we do our work in the world. And 3, she was determined. We have just come through this week of over-the-top Olympic athletes presented to us as determined and unstoppable heroes. In Margaret, we see a different kind of resilience. She wasn't out to win. She was simply determined to provide for her loved ones and also to honor and then use her own curiosity, and her own intellect. She wasn't living a competition. She was creating her own difficult but interesting life. Persistence, community, and determination. Always and forever reading, writing, thinking, and that romantic once bumping into an Italian freedom fighter who saw her for who she was. There needs to be a novel. He loved her, and they had a child. She was resilient. She opened a path, and we are still on it.